Welcome to FLESHGAIT, Part 1.
Months later, I can remember all of them, down to the slightest idiosyncrasies and quirks. They were my friends, and they're gone now. There's a hole in my life where they were. Sometimes I'll remember something they said or did, and it'll just hit me like a ton of bricks. They're gone now, and I'm only left with memories of them. I'm sorry for being mundane and bringing everyone else down, but I think this is the only way I could really introduce my story and explain why I feel like I have to type this out. I think that writing this is the only way I can learn to accept that. I'll try and keep these downer tendencies to myself as I'm writing all of this down, but I can't make any promises. I know that being the third wheel in a group can be a terrible thing, but I can think of something worse: being the fifth wheel. If you're the third wheel, that makes your group a semi-functional tricycle. If you're the fifth wheel, you're left as some obscure car from the 50s that no one remembers or even cares about. Imagine not being able to follow the in-jokes and shared history of one couple and multiply that by 2. Getting stuck as the fifth wheel is twice as bad. That was the frame of mind I had as we all paid into Ian's car to go into the National Forest for our hike. I know that's a weird opening to give all of this after my depressing opening, but I want you all to have an idea of my mindset. I'm not quite sure how to describe all of this, but I do know that I need to tell someone. I need someone else to know what happened and help me come to terms with it all. I think the only way I'll be able to explain this is to help you see from my perspective as much as possible. So, there we were, driving down to Gila for a hike, with me feeling like the fifth wheel wedged between 2 of Ian's friends who I don't even know. 3 of us were cramped in the back seat while Ian and his girlfriend were up front. I look back at that unnecessary bit of moping back in August of 2016 as one of the last few moments of normalcy I would have in my life. I tried to make the best of the situation. I really did. Ian was always more social of us. Our mom used to tell us that Ian could make anyone his friend, and that once I had a friend that I kept them. It was one of those parental platitudes that was given to us to reassure a socially awkward child that there was nothing wrong. Unfortunately, it would have taken me almost 19 years to learn that that wasn't true. Instead of taking my therapist's diagnosis of social anxiety disorder following a breakdown after an office get-together as a means for seeking treatment, I used it as an excuse to cloister myself up from the world. I stayed in my apartment when I wasn't working and told myself that I was just doing what was best for me. Of course, Ian decided that that wasn't healthy and convinced me to go on a weekend-long hike with him. It wasn't until I showed up at his house at 6 in the morning on Friday, after taking the day off work, that I saw that he had invited others along. I think he saw it as a means of me getting help and breaking me out of my shell. Unfortunately, though, with Ian's extroverted nature, he didn't even realize that I like being in my shell. It was comfortable. A turtle doesn't like being broken out of its shell. After a brief introduction where I caught no one's name except for those I already knew, my brothers and his girlfriend Jessica, due to morning grogginess and the rushed introduction, we packed up the car and left for our hike. It took 3 hours of mostly awkward silence for us to reach our destination. Ian tried to make conversation, but my short responses and the others' sleepiness killed him off fairly quickly. We had found the parking lot near the Gila Cliff dwellings. As we unpacked our gear, we took a moment to bask in the beautiful sight that sat perched above us. It's hard to believe that someone could carve an entire town into the face of a cliff. But 700 years ago, people managed to do just that. Given that the parking lot was empty, except for us, we would find out why later. And I was in need of some social lubrication. We split a 6-pack of beer and took in the majesty. Here's a picture in case you were wondering what the area looked like. As we finished our beers, got everything prepared, and used the restrooms, Ian explained what path we would be taking in detail. What we didn't know, and what my brother had failed to tell us, was that the West Fork Trail had been closed all that summer due to flooding. To be honest, the path wasn't that dangerous. They had just opted not to clear it due to the recent flooding, so it would be a bit more of a rugged hike. While it wasn't perilous in itself, it did keep us from encountering other hikers, which would cause a lot of problems when we actually needed help. Ian figured that we could make about 2 to 3 miles per hour, and we would be able to complete the Gila Loop, which was about 30 miles long, with enough time to get back on Sunday and be ready for our respective jobs on Monday, with no one any the wiser than we had backpacked a closed section of the national park. As his explanation was a bit heavy on names and locations, some of which I can't recall clearly, I'll opt to include a picture rather than spend a page writing out everything. For the sake of simplicity, this is the path we were planning to take. I'll include more detailed map in the area below. In addition, I'll include a more detailed map of the entire area so you can orient yourself if you want to trace the trail that we took. If you plan on following along with the path as I tell you about this experience, all I can say is good luck. Even as I stare at it now, I feel just as lost now as I was then. I was just going along with the group and trying to keep a positive mind about everything. I wanted to try and do a better job of getting to know Ian and Jessica's friends. I think my circumstances had finally begun to set in. I had been living in a quiet apartment in New Mexico for over a year, and I had no friends. I would go to work and then home without doing anything else. Sometimes I would spend the entire weekend without saying a single word to anyone or seeing another person. I knew that if I didn't change something quick, that solitude would become the norm, and that frightened me. Our first day was relatively quiet. We spent a majority of the time taking in the sights, soaking in the sun, and breathing the fresh air. The hike felt like we were constantly moving upward. As I was unaccustomed to hiking, I frequently fell behind, but I never completely lost sight of my brother's friends. While we took a break under the shade of a tree, whose bark looked like dried scales from some long, dead alligator, I tried to make small talk with everyone. I fell into a quick conversation with Ian and Jessica about their work and what they had been up to lately. When it came time to talk to the other two, I only managed to get to conversation going for a few sentences before it shriveled up and died. I remembered assuring myself that it would be easier when we stopped for the night. We rested before continuing our ascent up the mesa. This was where everyone realized how truly out of my element I was here. The path up the mesa was agonizing for me. It seemed to never stop climbing up, and there was almost no shade to keep the sun from beating down on us. I was sweating buckets, panting, and wheezing whenever they stopped to wait for me to catch up. I tried to pretend that I didn't notice their exasperated whispers or side glances, but it was easier said than done. They seemed like the outdoorsy type that had been doing this sort of thing for years. By the time our paths started to level out, I was ready to turn around and leave. It wasn't until we reached the top and looked out over everything that I realized how foolish of an idea that was. Even if I was able to convince Ian to give me the keys and let me walk back to the car and go home, I had no idea where I was going or what trail markers we had even been using. I imagined splitting off from the group and tromping through poison ivy, bumbling into a rapey gang of banjo-playing hillfolk, or getting lost in the dark and wandering in circles until exhaustion and exposure took me. Even if I did manage to hike back to the parking lot, where was I going to go? Would I go back home to my empty apartment, eat a Hot Pocket, and feel sorry for myself again? I decided to tough it out and continue hiking. We made camp at a dry section of the Indian Creek after having hiked a decent amount. Ian was confident that we would make it back on Sunday, and that the next few days were going to be less intensive. We ate some food and stowed the rest in a bear bag a ways away from the camp. We were passing a bottle of whiskey around in front of the campfire we had built when the conversation shifted to the most awkward moments everyone had experienced. Ian retold his story about the first time he met Jessica at a club where he was way too drunk for his own good and ended up puking into her purse. She bristled at the memory and jokingly called Ian an asshole for that. Each person shared their stories about a bumbling first kiss where their braces got hooked together, locking themselves out of their dorm rooms in their underwear, their cringe-inducing high school edgelord personality, and caring for their drunken boyfriend who puked into their favorite bag. Then the bottle came to me, and it was my turn to tell them a story. I instantly knew what my most embarrassing story was the moment we started the conversation. I didn't tell them about the door, though. Instead, I made up a story ripping my pants in front of a group of people during a work interview that I had probably ripped straight from a 90s sitcom. They laughed with me, and I felt like a piece of shit. They had bothered to reveal their most embarrassing moments and were commiserating in their shared experience, and here I was, too afraid to tell them the truth, to tell them about the door. The conversation continued for a bit afterwards as we killed the bottle. When it was dead, we all went to bed, still pretty drunk after dousing the campfire. I woke up in the middle of the night, desperately needing to use the bathroom, still a bit fuzzy from the whiskey. I tromped out to the woods to do my business. It wasn't until I was almost done that Nadia's voice cut through the blackness. She asked me if I had a lighter. Since I hadn't heard her approach, the sound of her voice made me jump. It would have scared the piss out of me had I not just gone to the bathroom. I mumbled something about her having a lighter back around the camp. She told me that she had dropped hers and asked me to help her look for it. But I was too out of it to be any good to anyone, so I told her that we'd have to look for it later. I vaguely remember her mumbling a protest as I stumbled back to my sleeping roll. It wasn't until I woke up the next morning that I realized how stupid I had been. Apparently, they had heard howling in the surrounding woods all last night. They thought that the sound could have possibly belonged to the Mexican gray wolf, but no one was sure. Ian knew that they inhabited the area, but were quite uncommon. I paled at the thought of being mauled by a wolf while out peeing in the middle of the woods. I decided next time I would wake up Ian before going out to the woods to answer the call of nature. We packed up a while later after a light breakfast and continued on our hike. The second day was a little better. The overbearing sun I suffered under previously was hidden behind heavy clouds. We crossed a number of rivers as we followed the 157 to 729 junction. We went along Little Bear Canyon as we headed towards the TJ Coral, which was towards the end of the hiking loop. As the path hadn't been cleared yet, we frequently had to dodge patches of poison ivy and stinging nettles. I fared much better on this hike, and despite nursing a slight hangover, I felt like I was doing a much better job of getting around with my pack and clunky boots my brother had loaned me. We made camp around midday and purified some water from a nearby river, boiling water and adding iodine tablets to them, as the last section of our hike didn't really have many opportunities for drinkable water. I think that maybe our encounter last night with the yipping and the howling wolves have added to a bit of seriousness to the hike, as there wasn't as much joking around or conversations this night. We did talk a little bit, but mainly just as something small to eat while we stared into the campfire. Ian and U.S.A were the first to call it for the night. I stayed up with the others for a bit, but we were mainly silent. The other two slowly went off after a bit, and I decided to enjoy the warmth a bit longer before getting ready to go to bed for the night. Just as I finished dousing the fire, I remember Gary coming up to me and asking for the map. He told me he wanted to plan out the rest of our trip, and that there was a spring nearby that we should really visit that wasn't too far out of the way. I grabbed the map from Ian's pack and gave it to him before turning in. I woke up the next morning to the sound of Ian rustling around his bag. He sounded angrier the longer he searched. He knocked mess kits into each other as he peered deep into the pack for something he was missing. Frustrated that he wasn't finding the item he was looking for, he turned the bag upside down and dumped out everything. He was practically ready to tear out his own hair, and it seemed like he had spent the entire morning looking for that one thing. Wanting to know what was up, I walked up to him and we started talking. He asked me, "Hey man, have you seen the map anywhere? I can't seem to find it." "Where's Gary? I gave him the map last night so he could map out a little detour on the trip so we could visit a spring. Why don't you ask him? He probably knows," I answered. It was then that Ian said something that changed everything. "Gary? Who are you talking about? Do you mean Oliver? Don't tell me you thought his name was..." I explained. "No, I'm talking about Gary. Tall guy, kinda lanky." "You're joking, right?" He looked confused for a few seconds and made a questioning sound like a really old computer trying to process something moments before it catches on fire. The pieces clicked and Ian shouted, "Who the fuck is Gary?" getting the attention of everyone in the area. "He was some fucking guy asked you for our map in the middle of the night and you just fucking gave it to him? You handed our stuff to some random stranger you met in the woods?" I tried to explain myself and tell him that I knew Gary and that he did too, since I remember hiking with him the day before, but I couldn't find the words to convey that point. It was here that U.S.A stepped in and asked what was going on. Ian vented, "How fucking stupid are you, Evan? Some random guy named Gary comes up to you in the middle of the night asking for our shit, and you just give it to him? Christ, we needed that map to get around smoothly since the trails out here haven't been cleared." Ian shouted for about 15 minutes while everyone became aware of our situation. U.S.A managed to calm him down enough so we could figure out our next move. While we weren't completely screwed, as Ian had mesmerized a large portion of the trail markers, it was going to be a lot harder to navigate the necessary junctions to bring us back around to our car. We packed up all of our stuff, making sure that the guy hadn't taken anything else, and we left. The entire hike, I could feel Ian's eyes drilling into me. The last time I had seen him this furious was just before he got into a fight with Aaron Fredlinger and beat him to a pulp. He got suspended for a week, and Aaron got a black eye, busted lip, and never said anything about our mom again. Each time we came across a break in the path, we spent a few minutes while Ian tried to remember where to go. The fact that the trails had been closed and the paths were overgrown only served to make everything more difficult. I think that's how we made a wrong turn and began wandering on the faint trail. I don't actually know if that's where it went wrong since we didn't have the map at that time, but that's my best guess. Further away from home and safety. Towards midday, tensions had reached a critical point. Ian frequently mumbled things that would make a sailor blush, while U.S.A tried to hide the fact that she was close to crying. Oliver attempted to lighten the situation by telling everyone that we just had to follow the compass and we would get home, safe and sound. Oliver's girlfriend didn't say much. She just stared quietly at her feet as she walked. I think she had the right idea since Lucas was constantly misplacing his footing and slipping. He looked like he had downed a fifth of vodka and was now trying to walk home on a tightrope while being randomly shocked with a cattle prod. The realization twisted something deep down inside and made me want to vomit. I stopped walking and began talking to Lucas. "What's going on with you, man?" Ian, still pissed off at me, took this opportunity to vent a bit. "Huh? What are you talking about now?" Lucas is bumbling and twitching all over the place. "What's wrong with... Don't be a dick, man. You know he has multiple sclerosis. We told you before the hike started about his condition." As soon as he said it, the events came rushing back to me, clear as day. I recalled Ian pulling me to the side and telling me about his friend's diagnosis, and how this was likely going to be his last opportunity to undertake a long hike like this. So, we had to help him move, and slowly. I remembered watching him scramble up the trail, and thinking about our own mom and her illness. It brought back bittersweet memories of birthday wishes given to us from hospital beds, and hearing her sob quietly to herself in the middle of the night, when she thought we were asleep. Guilt flooded over me, and I stepped forward to apologize to Lucas when it happened. Lucas growled at me the instant I took a step forward, and he dropped to a hunched position on his hands and feet. It almost looked like his skin was bristling at a possible threat, and I could see his broken and decaying teeth as he hissed at all of us before taking off at a hopping stride into the woods. He moved like one of those CGI monstrosities from the last Planet of the Apes movie. His shaky and unstable balance was replaced by a more natural and animalistic gait as he loped into the distance and disappeared amongst the trees. The last thing I saw was what I assumed were its clothes, sloughing off of its body, revealing that they weren't actually clothes, but gray folds of skin. Oliver was the first to talk. "What the fuck?" As soon as Oliver said those words, it was like a switch had flipped that set everyone to panic mode. We began to run along the trail as if it would do us any good. The only thought in my head was to put as much distance as possible between me and that thing. I think it took a good 15 minutes for us to run out of energy with our heavy packs and the disorienting nature of the woods. As we tried to catch our breath, I surveyed the area around us and came to a terrible realization. In our panic, we had run off the path and were now even deeper in the woods. We tried to make sense of what we saw. I just remember Ian mumbling the same phrase over and over. What the hell was that? The short answer is that it was Lucas. The long of it is this. There was no Lucas. Not really. I'm sorry for interrupting the story in the middle like this, but I think now is the best time to try and explain everything. I know how confusing this all seems with Gary and Lucas. The truth is, I did that because I don't think I could have appropriately explained to you without you first experiencing it from my eyes. I don't know what to call those things, but they do something to your mind. They insinuate themselves into your memories. They wrap themselves up in a wall of your reflections, and even though you know something is wrong, you can't quite put your finger on it. Your group of 4 friends could grow to 5, and you wouldn't be any the wiser. A part of you will stupidly admonish you forever. You look at it, and you recognize the face. You remember events. You remember getting drunk at a bar together. You remember them crying on your shoulder after a rough breakup. You remember everything that happened between you, but none of it's true. I don't know how it does it. It crawls into your head and somehow makes you see things in a way that benefits them. It can mold memories, but it can't mimic human movement. It walks on 4 claws, not 2 feet. It growls, hisses, and snarls. It does not talk. It infiltrates, observes, and waits. It was hunting us, trying to drive us deeper into the wilderness. It was succeeding. We never really reached much of a conclusion about what the thing was, but we did reach a consensus that we had to get out of there as soon as possible. I watched Ian as he looked around at the forest and came to the same realization that I did. We were lost. He didn't tell the others. I think he realized that panicking would only get us in more trouble. Instead, he told us to follow him. With the shock of our encounter setting in, we could do nothing but follow his lead and hope it all worked out. As we walked, we could hear the sounds of distant animals howling and calling out to each other. The terror of our situation deepened as the others whispered that those were the same noises they had heard the first night out in the woods. Whatever this thing was, it was following us and calling out to other things in the area. At the time, I couldn't stop thinking about one of them barreling out from the underbrush and sinking its black and rotting teeth into my neck before the rest of the group could react. I remember brushing the thought off and mentally reassuring myself that there was 6 of us here, and we had only actually encountered one of the creatures. As the day pressed on, we seemingly wandered the south in an attempt to pick up another trail that would lead us back to the parking lot. I couldn't help but shake a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. It felt like I had forgotten some important deadline that I should have never forgotten about. It wasn't until Oliver mentioned that his wish of being back in the car that Jessica stopped dead in her tracks. We all turned towards her, but knew what was coming the second she asked. We only took 1 car down, right? Ian snapped, more fearful than frustrated. Of course we did. Remember how cramped everyone was in that tiny-ass Prius with all of our camping gear smashed in the trunk and on our laps? What about it?" Jessica went white, as if this was the first time that Ian had ever raised his voice to her. She paused for a moment before asking, "How many of us are here right now, and how many does your car seat?" Ian's car sat 4 people comfortably, 5 uncomfortably, and there were 6 of us out in the woods that moment. Everything happened at once. Ian swore. Oliver's girlfriend gave a half shriek and a half gasp while I looked wide-eyed from person to person, trying to figure out which one of us didn't belong there. Sarah was the only one who managed to say something that was She hadn't finished her words before her jaw popped open. I don't mean that it dropped open like she was astonished at something. It popped open like it had dislocated from her face. The space between her lips was a massive, sickly pink void of inflamed gums that was at least a foot wide. She looked at us with dead and dull eyes as she slowly raised a twitching hand up to her jaw and tried to lock it back into a more human-esque appearance. Finally, she popped it back into place with a hollow-sounding squelch of meat and bone, shifting as if nothing was wrong about what had just happened before. She tried to speak again. "It's me." Ian was the first to react. He stepped towards this failed copy of a human and swung his walking stick at her face while bellowing, "Get out of here!" She hopped back from the attack in a sloppy motion and landed on all 4s. Her body shuddered as if an electrical jolt had passed through her as she slowly backed away from all of us while facing Jessica the entire time. She hissed at one of us one last time before retreating deeper into the woods with a convulsing loop. It took a moment for all of us to regain our composure before we continued walking while trying to look in every direction at once. I remember Oliver rambling as we walked. He kept asking, although no one was responding to him, "Did you see how it moved? It was twitching like a epileptic at a rave. You ever seen one of those documentaries about mad cow disease? That thing was twitching and moving like one of those infected cows. What the hell was that thing? Was it a person? What kind of person can do that to their body? It tried to talk to us. He rambled for hours before we had to stop. We had to tell him to shut up because we were worried about that thing hearing us, though that really wasn't the case. We made him stop talking because it only served to scare us. Despite stopping for the night, none of us actually slept. We sat around a campfire and listened to the sound of a high-pitched whining and yelping coming from all around us. It seemed like any time I actually got close to falling asleep, the calls would start up and jolt me awake. We spoke in hushed whispers and tried to figure out what they wanted with us, even though none of us really wanted the answer to that question. The hours dragged on almost endlessly before dawn broke, and we continued our hike. We spent Sunday hiking around trying to find a familiar sight, without any real sense of where we were and where we were going. Our only hope was to stumble across another hiker or find an area with a high enough vantage point that we could survey the entire area. Unfortunately, any elevations we climbed didn't afford a good view of the area, and it was extremely unlikely that we would find another hiker due to the fact that the trail had been closed and wasn't cleared. Even if we did, what are the chances that we would trust them and could be certain that it wasn't one of those things? I hope you enjoyed part 1 of FLESHGAIT. Stay tuned for part 2, to the conclusion of the story. Stay alert, lock your windows, and keep a lookout. You never know what's lurking in the night.